Are you a beginner in the world of track saws and MFTs? If so, you may be wondering, what's an MFT? Well, it stands for multi-function table. How do I know that? Because I'm an expert. I've been using track saws and MFTs for almost 3 weeks, so I'm here to share my vast expertise. Just in case that joke was too subtle, let me be clear. I'm still a beginner too. I still watch Peter Millard's videos like an hour a day. Who's Peter Millard? I'll put a link in the description. So track saws and MFTs are new to me, but I am an experienced woodworker and I feel like I'm coming up to speed pretty quickly. Nonetheless, my value add for making a video about these tools is not my vast expertise. It's that I remember very clearly what it was like to not know things, because that wasn't that long ago. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the first things that happens when you get a track saw, and that is to cut the splitter guard on the rail. Let's just mention a couple of basics. What's an MFT? As I said, a multi-function table, and MFT is a term that is used to describe a class of woodworking workbenches with certain characteristics. I believe the term MFT was popularized by Festool. Someone in the comments, please correct me if I'm wrong. Nonetheless, this class of workbenches tends to have things like dog holes which are spaced at 96 millimeters apart, and they're 20 millimeters in diameter. They're round holes into which you can stick things, all kinds of accessories. These accessories range from clamps to fences to various other things. They also tend to have tracks on the sides, which also provide a place to attach things. There are a number of vendors that make MFT style benches. This one is made by Dashboard. What's a track saw? You can think of a track saw as a circular saw with two differences. One is the blade can plunge. Regular circular saws don't do that. Two, a track saw rides on a track, also called a guide rail, and that track makes possible the ability to cut in a straight line. What I want to talk about here is one of the first things that happens when you get a track saw and a new track, and that is you have to cut the splinter guard. I'll show it in a minute more closely. But the bottom line is the very first thing you do to your guide rail, which in some cases is rather expensive, is you alter it. And that made me nervous. And if you're new to this world, you might be nervous too. So that's why I want to talk about it. So as I said, track saws ride on tracks or guide rails. This is a Festool guide rail. It is an FS 1900, and in Festool's numbering system, the number corresponds to the length of the guide rail in millimeters. This is a 1900 millimeter guide rail. One of the things that as I was mentioning, a guide rail comes with a splinter guard, and this is the plasticky strip on the edge of the guide rail, and this needs to be customized for your saw. This guide rail has not had its splinter guard, its plasticky strip, cut yet. It's brand new out of the box. And one of the first things you have to do is you have to cut this splinter guard with your saw to make sure that it is customized for your saw. So mounted vertically at the moment here is another guide rail. This is a Festool 1080, meaning that it is 1,080 millimeters long, and this one has already had its splinter guard cut by my track saw. Note that the end of the rail does not, in my case, have the splinter guard cut all the way to the end. And that's because when you cut the splinter guard with your saw, there's no way to have the saw fully supported far enough for the saw to cut all the way to the end of the splinter guard. And so it's fine to just leave it like this. Some people take a knife and cut it so that it looks better, but it won't matter because that part of the splinter guard isn't actually going to be used for cuts anyway. To be clear, since this video is specifically aimed at beginners like my recent self, I just laid this guide rail on top of this guide rail. And you would never do that. This is not a configuration that makes any sense. This guide rail is mounted on my MFT's hinge so that it can easily go up and down, and it's in a position used typically for cross cuts. This one is sitting here in the front of my bench because I'm preparing to cut the splinter guard, and this is the configuration which is used for rip cuts. This one that I'm about to cut is my third guide rail, and it is common for woodworkers to have more than one guide rail of different lengths for different purposes. My first two guide rails, the way I cut them is that I laid them on a sacrificial piece of scrap plywood so that I could cut through the splinter guard into something else and get all the way through. And that's why there are grooves in this piece of plywood. One for each splinter guard that I've already cut. But this piece of plywood is not long enough to cut a 1900 millimeter rail. So it's time for me to find a different way to do it. I watched a very helpful video from Festool themselves about how to cut these splinter guards. I'll link that video in the description of my own video here. One of the things that the gentleman said in that video was that you can cut your splinter guard by laying the rail on a piece of sacrificial wood like I did for my first two, or you can just hang it off the edge of your bench. And to be honest, I was nervous enough cutting a thing that I just paid so much money for, because frankly, these rails are not cheap. And then, he said, hang it off the end of a bench. That made me even more nervous. And so I went with the plywood. So instead of hanging it off the edge of a bench, I can just put the guide rail here on my dashboard in the regular rip configuration, and it will be well supported. Why? Because here, the dashboard, if I can lift this up, is set up with what it calls spiral dogs. That's hard to see. There we go. These are rail dogs, are things that you use to attach a guide rail to an MFT. Dashboard's concept of this is called spiral dogs. And by putting it on the MFT in this fashion, it's very well supported and it's not going to move. So I feel more confident cutting the splinter guard here because everything will be very stable. Compared to the Festool MF3, one of the doctrinal differences with dashboard is that dashboard is designed such that you're never cutting your top. If you see videos with a Festool MFT, it's very common for users of those MFTs to actually just do cuts across their top, and there will be cut marks all over the place, which is fine once you're used to it. That's just not the way the dashboard was designed to be used. The Festool MFT regards the top as a consumable item, like a drill bit, perhaps. Whereas the dashboard system, like I said, is designed so you're not cutting the top, which means cuts happen in one of two places. There is a blue sacrificial strip over here, specifically oriented for cross cuts with this guide rail on a hinge. There is also the provision or the practice of doing cuts where the cut line or the splitter guard or the blade, all the same thing, are just off the edge of the workbench. In this case, the spiral dogs I just pointed out are actually inserted in a special set of holes that are not round, but a little bit elongated. They're almost oval. And these holes are the right distance away from the edge of the bench to make sure that when you drop the spiral dog into that hole, the splitter guard will be in the right place off the edge of the bench so that you can cut there. What do I mean when I say the right place off the edge of the bench? I mean two things. One, it's not on the edge of the bench. The blade is going to be over here, so you're not cutting into the bench. Two, it's not too far. I don't have a ruler handy, but this is pretty close. If it stuck out much further, then the track would not be well supported, and there would be a possibility that the track would bend during the cut, thus making things less accurate. So there's a compromise being made here, which is keep it away from the bench so you're not cutting things that aren't supposed to be cut, but don't make it too far because you want it to be well supported. Another major issue to mention for a beginner is cut depth. Track saws can have their depth of cut adjusted. This is my track saw. It's a Festool TS-75, capable of a little deeper cut than is typical of track saws because I wanted to be able to cut thicker and heavier woods. I currently have the depth of cut set at about 1¼ inches, which for cutting the splitter guard of a new guide rail is way, way too deep. If I forget to adjust this before I do the cut, then I will cut something that doesn't want to be cut. And those expensive things that don't want to be cut and that I do not want to cut are these items in the front. It is common with an MFT to attach things to the front track of the bench, or actually any track all around the bench. This is a track star that Dashboard calls it, and it is a device with various ways of attaching things that can go anywhere on the bench. This is my front guide rail bracket, and it is what holds the cross-cut guide rail in place so that it is kept square. These two things I left here intentionally so I could show that if I were to cut too deep, I would risk damaging these pieces of equipment. And I don't want to do that. So I remind myself when using a track saw all the time that keeping the cut depth correct for each cut is rather important. So I'm going to adjust the depth on my track saw right now. Adjusting the depth is as simple in this case as pushing in on this thing and moving it. Right now I'm moving it down, cutting it even deeper, making my problem even worse. But I'm doing that to show a couple things. One, when you move this thing, it's just a stop. It is the thing that's going to prevent the blade from going further as you plunge. I am not moving the blade itself. I'm just moving this stop. So for example, my saw is unplugged, so there's no risk of any problem here. If I were to press this button to unlock and do the plunge, I can move it without actually the saw turning. And what's holding it from going any further right now is that it's sitting on the bench. But if it were sitting with the blade off the bench, this is what would stop it. The other thing, and this is a bit hard to see just esoterically, is right there is a little place to put what they call a grub screw that you can use for fine adjustments of the depth. I'm not using that right now. Bottom line, I need to set the depth of this cut to cut the splinter guard very shallow. So I'm going to move this to, let's say 1/4 inch. Let's go 1/4 inch and another 1/16. So that should be enough to cut the splinter guard because I just am cutting through a very thin piece of plastic. Back over here at my cross-cut guide rail, which is once again resting incorrectly on the other guide rail, which is a disaster waiting to happen because this guide rail is sitting in the cut line of this guide rail waiting to be cut. Terrible idea, but I digress. The point I'm making over here is that these are Dashboard's universal setup blocks. What you do is you drop in a dog, you put the setup block here, and then you adjust the guide rail, which is currently not because it's sitting too high. You adjust the guide rail up against this face of the universal setup block, this face here. And that's how you get things lined up. The point I want to make here is that because you're adjusting the splinter guard up against the USB, you must have your splinter guard cut before you do this. Okay, I have my track saw mounted on the guide rail, preparing to cut my splinter guard. I currently still have everything not plugged in yet, but I just wanted to show this. And that is that I typically, as I said earlier, I like to be sure that I have the blade depth too far. And one of the ways that I verify things sometimes is that I put the saw in place, unplugged, press this, and plunge the saw to make sure that it won't hit something it's not supposed to hit. And I did that. Unsurprisingly, I can't use this trick now because it's hitting the splinter guard, which is exactly what it should be doing. So nonetheless, I can't do my usual pre-flight NASA safety checks because for this particular cut, because this is the first cut ever with this guide rail. I have to admit I'm a little grouchy about that, but I will be careful when I start the cut just to be sure that I didn't go too far. I should point out that I don't think experienced track saw users are this paranoid about depth of cut because they're so used to it that they don't make those mistakes in practice. Nonetheless, I'm still being pretty careful. Just an aside, if you have a Festool track saw and are a beginner, you may have noticed this piece of plastic and wondered, why doesn't my saw have that? Well, the answer is my saw didn't have that either. Festool saws have a hole here, and I don't know why that hole is there. I don't know why I don't know that anyone knows why that hole is there. What I do know is that people tend to cover it with custom-made pieces of plastic available from a variety of sources. I thought I had found the only one, and turns out that there are lots of companies that make this custom piece of plastic, and they're available in different colors. Anyway, everyone else was doing it. I did it too, just basic peer pressure. Here's another quick tidbit before I go ahead and make this cut. One of the things that I have been told, and I was repeating in this video, is that you cut your splinter guard to make sure that it is customized for your particular saw. However, it apparently is not true that you have to customize it for each blade. The TS-75, for example, comes with a certain blade. Well, every saw comes with a certain blade. But today purchased a new blade for my track saw. This one is a rip blade. The one that comes with the TS-75 is a more universal blade, I believe they call it, designed for different kinds of cuts. But I need to cut this weekend a very thick piece of oak. And for that, I wanted a rip blade because I'm going to do a rip cut in a very thick piece of hardwood. And my understanding is, which I will soon experience to confirm, is that once you have customized the splinter guard for your saw, that will be fine for any blade you put in the saw, even if the kerf width of that blade is different, because what you're customizing it for is this side of the blade, not this side of the blade. I hope that makes sense. I do believe it is worth making sure, double checking things to make sure that I don't cut something like the bench or a track star or the aluminum part of the rail. However, if you make a mistake doing this, let's just remind ourselves, all is not lost. The rail is expensive. This little strip is not. You can replace this strip. I believe it's under $20 US. I think, don't hold me to that, but I priced it just as a ballpark to reassure myself at some point when I first started cutting these that a mistake wasn't that big of a deal. As it happens, I haven't had any sort of disasters on my first two. I don't expect a disaster on this one either, but it's worth observing that This is a replaceable piece of plastic. Okay, I have plugged in my saw to prepare for this cut. You may notice that I did not plug in dust collection for this particular cut. It feels weird to run this saw without setting up dust collection. It would also feel weird to set up dust collection for a cut that isn't cutting any wood. It's just a plastic strip. So I'm not sure it matters very much. I came over to this side of the saw just to show one thing that I learned in the actual Festool video, which I am not trying to duplicate, but I just want to mention here for completeness. They recommend that you start the cut with this green knob lined up with the end of the rail, which is why you're not cutting all the way to the end of the rail, because the blade isn't back here, it's up here. Okay, I'm back on this side, and I'm going to do my initial test cut holding the camera still, just to make sure that I have my depth right. So I ran the plunge all the way to the stop I had set up. It is cutting through the plasticky strip, and it is cutting nothing further of any consequence. I conclude that I am ready for the actual cut. Okay, let's briefly review what went right and what went wrong here. The most obvious thing is I was dragging the cord and it kept getting hung up on things. This is a mistake I tend to forget about. Nonetheless, no harm done. Mistake number two, my goodness, dust collection probably would have been a good idea. This is plastic bits, but I think it qualifies as dust. So that's something I should have done. However, it doesn't seem like I caused any real problems, and the splinter guard looks, well, cut. I took it all the way to the point where I was supposed to, which, by the way, is the same as the other side. This little green knob is supposed to approximately line up with the end of the guide rail, and that is why over here you can see that the last few inches of the splinter guard are not cut. So, mistakes were made, but I will consider this a success. So yeah, as I start the cleanup process here, I'm gonna need to clean up all this plastic dust, or whatever we're calling it. But I just want to say, I promised myself I would not become a Festool zealot. Nonetheless, when I clean up this dust, I'm going to use my regular old shop vacuum and not my Festool dust extractor. And the reason why is because a shop vac is for cleaning up messes. And this is a dust extractor. It's a whole different thing. It's for extracting sawdust, which is a higher calling than cleaning up messes. And I am not a Festool zealot. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.